Hi there, everyone. This is our fourth and final week of a part of our mental health session. And today we're going to be having April Lott, President and CEO for Directions for Living, presenting to us youth suicide prevention. So I'm going to hand it over to April Lott, and thank you so much for being here, everyone.
Okay, thank you. So I really put this presentation together based strictly on the questions that were asked from the committee, and I think it'll lead to certainly good dialogue. If you have other questions as we go, I'm happy to answer. Them. All right, I'm trying to see how I keep going here with my, oh, there we go. All right, so the first question that came in is, what is your background and how did you get into this profession? So my name is April Lott. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I was born and raised right here in Pinellas County. And when I was about 14 years old, I read a book that was called God Has a Kid's Face, which was just revolutionary for me. And I felt like I had been called to do work with, in particular, with children. And I started doing a lot of volunteer work at that point with youth, in particular, troubled youth and teenage parents and those kinds of things. And then my parents required me to go to the St. Pete Junior College. So what today is known as St. Pete College was back then St. Pete Junior College. So I went to St. Pete Junior College. My parents wanted me to go there for 2 years, but I did all of the coursework in 1 year so that I could get to FSU quicker, where I actually got 3 degrees from FSU. I got a bachelor's degree in psychology and then a bachelor's degree in social work and then a master's degree in social work. And then I started working. I was a probation officer first and did probation and parole, sex crimes against children. Then I started working for HRS, which is the former division of Health and Rehabilitative Services, which did all the investigations for child abuse and neglect. And quite frankly, the rest is history. I kind of moved up from there, and now I'm in this role. And I've been in my position here at Directions for Living for just about 15 years.
Yeah, so you have tons of experience with all these situations and even schooling experiences as well.
Yeah, I do. And I love, it's funny, I love school, number one, but number two, I love to learn. And I think that so many of the social services just kind of collide with each other, if you will. And, I just, anyway, so here we are now. I've been at Directions, like I said, for about 15 years, and I love my position here. So the next question is, are there any statistics available on how youth suicide has been affected by COVID-19? There really hasn't been a lot of statistics on death by suicide due to COVID-19 yet. As you know, we're still pretty early in this crisis. I will say, however, that suicide is a major public health concern. And when I talk about death by suicide, I think it's important that we also talk about thoughts of suicide. It's also important that we talk about suicide attempts, and that we then also talk about death by suicide. I think oftentimes we kind of jump straight to death by suicide, and we overlook the numbers of people who consider and or think about suicide and those who have attempted suicide. So no new data has been released. I suspect, as many of you may know, after any crisis, and we're in the middle of a public health crisis as it relates to COVID. We also are in the middle of a mental health crisis, a homeless crisis, a death by suicide crisis. We kind of are in what I call the trifecta. But usually after a national disaster such as the pandemic, usually we'll start to see data released somewhere between 12, 24, and 36 months after the end of that. And as you know, we have not reached the end. So I suspect that we will be seeing the aftermath of COVID well into the year 2023, 2024. But assumptions can be made because we have history and we know that suicide among youth increases during times of crisis. So we know that from past experience. And so I think we can, to answer that question directly, I think we can make some assumptions that suicide will happen more frequently. I just wanted to give you some statistics because I think that statistics sometimes can be valuable. So suicide is the 10th leading cause of death in the United States. And what I want to say there is that it is the second leading cause of death among adolescents and teens. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a minute. You might be surprised to know that approximately 132 individuals in the U.S. die by suicide each day. 90% of those who died by suicide had a mental health condition at the time of their diagnosis, at the time of their death. So, some of these statistics, I think, depending on where you're coming at it from, for example, the cost of suicide, right, is about $69 billion. So I think that the issue of preventing suicide really should be a focus for everybody, regardless of kind of where you stand on the issue. So it's the 10th leading cause of death. We talked about that. 132 people die by suicide every day. There's one death by suicide every 12 minutes, and 45,000 people a year die by suicide. I think what's particularly important is that depression, which is often a precipitating factor to death by suicide, approximately 20 to 25% of people who are 18 years of age or older will suffer with depression at some point in their life. The other thing that I want to say here that I think is important for all of us to know is that the number one common denominator to people who die by suicide is not a mental illness. In fact, it is isolation and loneliness. And so when I think about the pandemic and the question about, have we seen an increase due to COVID, I am anticipating that we will begin to see an increase as a result of the isolation that is just kind of this byproduct of COVID-19. The next question is, if we see someone struggling, what can we do to help? So depression, I want to always say that the two leading causes of mental health conditions in our country is depression and anxiety. And so where there is depression, there is always the risk of suicide. And that's important to know. Unfortunately, I think people use the word depression often when they don't really mean clinical depression or a diagnosis of depression. It's conversational. We'll ask each other how we're feeling, and somebody might respond, "I'm feeling depressed," when really they don't meet the criteria or the definition for depression. So depression is often overused as a term because it really is a medical diagnosis or a medical term. Nonetheless, if somebody responds by saying, "I'm feeling depressed," we do want to take note of that. Suicide is 100% preventable, which I think is the reason that the statistics on suicide are so hard to swallow and so hard to understand. Usually when I am doing a presentation such as this and I'm in person with people, I'll ask people, so I'll ask you as well, how many of you know somebody who has either thought about suicide or actually died by suicide?
I know of a few.
Me as well.
Yeah. So how about the rest of you? You can enter into the chat if you feel more comfortable speaking that way. Sarah says yes. Alyssa says yes. it's interesting that the majority of people that when I present and or speak to, and I ask that question, almost without exception, the majority of people in the room either know somebody personally or know somebody through a friend who has died by suicide. So one thing that we know is that 1 in 5 people live with a depressive or anxiety disorder. And I think the reason that's important is because of stigma, that we have to start talking about these illnesses and these issues so that people don't feel so ashamed of acknowledging an illness. Just like, so for me, I live, for example, with a thyroid disorder, Hashimoto's. I have diabetes. I wear a scanner on my arm. I don't even remember that it's there. But yet people will come up to me often and ask me about the disc that's attached to my arm. And they will, say, is that for diabetes? Sometimes people will say, is that a stem cell? But people, have no, what's the word, embarrassment of just coming up and asking me about it, right? And I have no shame either. I'm like, oh yeah, I think everybody should have one. And I'll talk about, my diabetes all day long if somebody wants to talk about it. But when someone lives with a depression or an anxiety disorder, we often shy away from having the conversation. We shy away from asking how somebody's feeling and or kind of addressing it up front, and we do this shame thing. And I think that's the stigma that we're trying to overcome. The other thing that we know is that only half of the people who actually are diagnosed with a depressive disorder or an anxiety disorder actually get treatment, which is so unfortunate, because the people who get treatment, 80 to 90% of them get better. They feel better, they get better, they do better. Treatment works, and we know that treatment works. And so one of the best things that we can do for people is really encourage them to get connected to services.
Hey, April, before you move on, it's Ashley. Since you were just addressing stigma right there, that's something that we've been pretty impressed with this group about, having these open conversations. So since you've been in this field for so long, could you give us an idea of how far, if we've come far, on reducing or ending the stigma on talking about these issues and actually being able to get help as a result?
Yeah, I think we have. We've come actually very far. We've got a long way to go, but I do think that we've come a long way, especially with our teens and our young adults and adolescents who just seem to be so willing to take on these bigger issues and talk about them and, tackle them, kind of thing. So we do see that. But, we also know that many people still are just ashamed and embarrassed and just not willing to talk about it. And we know that, for example, cancer, all of you are pretty young, young adults, young people. For me, when I was younger, people didn't talk about cancer. I mean, it was considered the C word. Like, people would lower their voice when they talked about cancer, or, kind of cover their mouth. Did you hear? Right. It was very shameful. And people were embarrassed about cancer and referred to it as the C word, kind of thing. And so, and now people openly talk about cancer. And so what we see with mental illness in particular is that we're kind of taken that same evolution. But what we know for sure, for example, is with cancer, if I were to ask all of the participants today from YAC to give me a word that you would use to describe somebody living with cancer, most people use words like brave and strong, and they're my hero, kind of thing. But if we ask for words to describe somebody who's living with a depression, we often use different words, and they aren't nearly as powerful and strong of words, right? We often, use words like weak, sad. We're not using words like brave and strong. And I would say that people who live with depression and get up every day and go to school or go to work are as strong and brave as somebody who's living with a physical health condition like a cancer. So I think we've come a long way. To answer your question directly, I think we have a long way to go. And oftentimes it's with the grown-ups as opposed to, the young adults and the adolescents who seem to be so willing to kind of get their hands dirty and say, let's talk about it.
I also had a question. This
Yep.
is Maddie in regards to the 80 to 90% who receive treatment feel better.
Yep.
If they're not wanting to receive that treatment professionally, how are they supposed to receive it? Because I know I've been in this circumstance where the certain person doesn't want to go to any mental health professional because they feel embarrassed about it. But
Yeah.
I'm definitely not a professional, so I can't give them any information in regards to helping them besides the directions to go to the mental health facilities.
Right. Well, I think, Maddie, is that a Maddie who was talking?
Yes.
I think, Maddie, that it's an excellent question, and I have a slide or two later on it, but what I will answer with you is that, number one, I think that the silver lining, if you will, to the pandemic is that virtual services, telehealth services, virtual services is so now much more widely accepted, and so is telephonic services. So I'm wondering if we're not going to start seeing more people who have been unwilling to get services because they don't want to go to a facility or go to see a professional actually be willing to do it because they can do it from the privacy of their home and or their phone kind of deal. But the other answer to your question is that not everybody needs professional help. In other words, there are self-help books. There are certainly, self-help, kind of videos and YouTube channels and chat groups and Facebook groups and that kind of thing. So, depending on what the need actually is, and we're going to talk, I have some slides later about, using chat features, apps that you can have on your phone, telephone, crisis lines, that kind of thing. So I think there are other ways to get help without actually having to go to a facility for somebody who's not interested in that.
Thank you.
So the next question you guys presented to me is, are suicide rates higher for youth, young adults, or older adults? And, this is kind of a hard question to answer for a variety of reasons, but what I can tell you is this, and I've said this already, right? It's the 10th leading cause of death in the US. It's the second leading cause of death among youth. But all age groups, races, religions, ethnic groups, right, are almost equal. We certainly see sometimes, for example, in a particular age group that we can see, that there's a higher proportion of people in a particular age group or a particular race or a particular ethnic group. But it's really hard to kind of take it apart that way because there's not the same numbers of people in each of those groups. And so it's sometimes a little hard to say. I will say that the LGBTQ youth and young adults are at higher risk. We are seeing certainly that manifest itself. We do know that death by suicide is about 4 times higher among males than females. Although I want to talk about that a little bit, because what we also know is that females are attempting to die more often than males, but males are more successful at dying by suicide than females. And so, what the research is showing us is that males, young men in particular, but males who make a decision to die by suicide often make a decision to use very lethal means, such as a gun, and females often make a decision and to die by poisoning or an overdose of some form of medication or over-the-counter medication. And medications really have been created these days to prevent people from being able to overdose on them. And so often we can save the life of somebody who's tried to die by overdose, whereas if a gun is used, it's often very difficult. So this question is hard to answer, but it's a fair question certainly to ask. We do see that females that are at the highest risk and or the highest number of successful suicides, it really is in the age group of 45 to 54. And for men, it is often over the age of 65, which might surprise you. And I would say that that is generally because of things like they've retired, they no longer feel like they're needed in society, and illness begins to creep in. But I wanted to try to get to the question I think that you were asking, and so I wanted to show you some numbers. This is from last year. The number of 10 to 15-year-olds last year was approximately 610 to 14-year-olds. And from the 15 to 24-year-olds, there was about 6,211. And then from 25 to 34, you can see that number goes up. It's about 8,020. We do know that death by suicide is happening at twice the rate of people dying by homicide or murder, someone killing them. So this is, it really is a public health crisis and I'm so grateful that this group, the YAT group, is committed to understanding this topic and taking it on. And, I hope many of you actually, after you graduate high school and go on to college, that, you'll continue to advance this conversation in college campuses or tech schools or in your, your social groups, because it really is one that's important. And one of the things I want you to remember me saying after today is that death by suicide is 100% preventable. And it is often the number one contributing factor is loneliness and isolation. It's people not feeling connected. And I think if we can do more to include people and help people feel a part of a group, it really can be very helpful. So what can we do if we know someone who's mentioned self-harm or suicide? So first of all, I really want to encourage everybody to get out your cell phone and enter this number. Oftentimes, we don't know the number right off the top of our head. And so somebody's in crisis, one of your peers or someone that is having a problem and you don't know the number to give it to them. So I encourage everybody just to take out your cell phone and put it in your cell phone so that you always have it. You never know when you might need it. And it is pretty easy to remember in terms of 1-800-273-TALK or 8255. But I do want to talk a little bit about self-harm, since that was included in the question. Self-harm, which includes things like cutting and hair pulling and head banging, burning the skin, those kinds of things, generally are not a suicide attempt. People who self-harm generally are not suicidal. With that said, I often hear people say things like, well, they're just trying to seek attention. They're just an attention seeker. It's a cry for help. What I would say to that is, yes, they are seeking attention and we need to give it to them. So the idea of someone who is just trying to seek attention we ignore really is not the answer. And self-harm will not go away by ignoring it. So, and self-harm can result in death. So even though it's not a suicide attempt, it really can end in death if somebody ups the antes high enough, especially with cutting or burning. And generally with self-harm behavior, professional help is required. And just like I said earlier to Maddie's question, it doesn't necessarily have to be like you go into an office and it's clinic-based counseling, but It could be telehealth, it could be on the phone, it could be texting with a professional, and those opportunities exist. But does anybody have any questions about self-harm as it relates to your question? Okay, so in terms of what we do, self-harm and kind of thoughts of suicide and or, planning a suicide are very different. If somebody is expressing thoughts of suicide and or a plan to die by suicide, the first thing is tell an adult. And I know that can be hard and might feel like it's a violation of trust and those kinds of things. But the fact of the matter is that every single threat or ideation of suicide has to be taken seriously. Even if it's someone that you've known for years and it's like, yeah, but that's just Ashley. She just says stuff like that. She doesn't really mean it. I would really encourage you to not rest on that kind of thing, because, I've already shown the numbers. We have a lot of adolescents dying by suicide. And, if you talk to somebody in the school system, what they would tell you is that the vast majority of kids who are dying by suicide in Pinellas County are not the people that you think they are. They are not the people who don't have any friends. In fact, the majority of them have friends. Oftentimes they are cheerleaders and sports players and captains of football teams and that kind of thing. And they appear to look at them, they appear to be people who have it all together and or who, have friends and those kinds of things. So I think we have to learn not to make assumptions about people. In fact, I don't want to make an assumption even that the people that are on this committee haven't previously had a thought of dying by suicide. We want to understand and respect the fact that all of us at one time in our life could really have a period where we feel hopeless and helpless, and that we feel like our worth, that we'd be better off dead, or that the people around us would be better off if we were dead. So one of the things I would say is that we want to talk with people using straight talk. And I can't emphasize this enough, that we're using straight talk when we're talking to people who've expressed this thought to you. Obviously the better you know them, the easier it is to do straight talk. But what I mean by straight talk is this: are you thinking about suicide? Asking the question just that directly, right? Are you thinking about suicide? And if the answer is yes, right, the very next question, well, how would you do it? How would you die by suicide? That's an important question, because the answer to that question tells us how quickly we need to get this person connected to services and to a professional. So I encourage straight talk because when we start saying things like, are you thinking about hurting yourself? Well, as we just covered, hurting yourself, i.e. self-harm, and dying by suicide are two very different things. I think we shy away from the word suicide because of stigma, and because we're afraid that we're going to offend somebody, it's going to hurt somebody's feelings, or sometimes I hear that people think that it'll give somebody an idea. Understand that there is zero research, no research that supports that by asking the question, are you thinking about suicide, will it ever put the thought in somebody's head? There's no research to support that. Depending on their answers to some of those questions, though, do not leave somebody alone. If somebody says that they are considering suicide, they have a plan, they tell you what that plan is, it is imperative that we get an adult to them, and that they are not left alone for any period of time. I think the thing that probably would be the hardest is involving parents. I would encourage you as young adults and young people, that you have in your cell phone the phone numbers to your friends' parents. Not that you would ever use it, but if you needed to text a mom or a dad or an aunt or an uncle to say, I think, my friend is in trouble, that you could get to somebody without a whole lot of frustration. And then, of course, depending on their answer, you want to make sure that they know about 1-800-273-TALK, because sometimes people don't have a plan. They're just thinking about it, and they're feeling overwhelmed and sad. Encouraging them to use a 1-800 number can be very helpful. These 1-800 numbers are available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. There's no cost. I have a slide later that's going to give you the text option, so people can text and get a licensed counselor to text them back 24 hours a day. And at Directions, we have a campaign here that's called No Shame, right? So it's literally #NoShame. We want people to have no shame in reaching out to a 1-800 number. Nobody would ever know it. It's private, it's confidential. Your friends would never know it, right? Parents would never know it, that kind of thing. So these are some ways to, in terms of what you can do to respond if you think somebody's in trouble.
April, we also have a couple questions that just came in the chat. One of them you covered a little bit with the slide. I think she got it in there a little earlier, but if your friend is talking about suicide, should you tell one of their parents or a school counselor? So you went over parents and adults, and how about in Pinellas County school counselors? Is
Yes.
that a good avenue?
Absolutely. And, unfortunately, the number of school counselors, many years ago, probably 10 years ago, were reduced, in schools. But I can tell you in Pinellas County, we have, a pretty good cadre of licensed clinical social workers who work for the school system and that are available. But to answer the question directly, absolutely. If you have a school counselor on your campus, then absolutely go straight to that school counselor. But I just always want to say that if you don't know who the school counselor is, you don't have one on campus, but you feel pretty comfortable with the football coach, or you feel pretty comfortable with your English teacher, or that you have a conversation with the assistant principal. In other words, whatever adult makes the most sense to you, and that you have access to and or have relationship with, absolutely tell that individual. I think that, I think one of the questions, and maybe this is the question, but I think one of the questions is what if the person says, I'm going to tell you, but you can't tell anybody? Yeah, I think this is it. Yeah. So, what should you do if someone tells you they're thinking about hurting themselves? Again, remember, hurting themselves and suicide are two different things. So I answered this question through the lens of suicide. If one of your peers or friends or someone is telling you that they are hurting themselves, i.e. cutting, burning, head banging, that kind of thing, my answer might be a little different than if they told you that they're thinking about dying by suicide. If they're thinking about dying by suicide and they want you not to tell anyone, the fact is that you never, ever, ever, ever would agree to that. There is zero circumstance in which you would ever agree to that. So you have to say, you might have said yes, right? So someone might say to you, I have something to tell you, but you can't tell anybody. Do you promise not to tell anybody? And you say yes, because you have no idea what they're getting ready to tell you. And you say yes. And then they tell you, I've really been having a hard time and I'm thinking I'm going to die by suicide. You have to, at that point, say, I can't keep that a secret. And if you feel like you can't say that because that would upset them more, you still can't keep it a secret. Even if you just said that you wouldn't tell anybody, you do still have to tell. Because we know that teens dying by suicide is the second cause of death in this country. It's happening over and over and over again. And so we don't want you to ever be in a position where you feel like you could have done something and you didn't, and then someone dies by suicide, and then you're left feeling guilt and or remorseful. So we know that 1 in 5 teens reports thinking about dying by suicide. There was a survey that went out last year, and I don't know if any of you had the opportunity to take it, but it certainly revealed that in Pinellas County, we have a lot of adolescents, a lot of teens, a lot of youth who are thinking about suicide. We also know that 1 death by suicide occurs for every 25 attempts. So there's quite a number of youth who are attempting to die by suicide, but are surviving, thank goodness. But nonetheless, I started the presentation by saying that we have to think about the number of kids or youth that are thinking about it, those that have a plan, those who are attempting, and then ultimately those who are successful. So you can see here, the elderly, by the way, die more often with attempts, and it is really because of how fragile generally that age group is with underlying health conditions. But you can see here that in the US that over 9 million have a serious thought, almost 3 million make a plan, a little over 1 million are attempting, and then approximately 43,000 people die by suicide every year. So again, I just can't emphasize enough that this is real. It's happening with incredible frequency, and there's almost not too much that we can do. We can't have the conversation too much. We can't remind each other too much about this subject. So the next question that came in is, what is a Baker Act or a Marchman Act? So a Baker Act is actually an involuntary, generally speaking, it's an involuntary admission to a hospital, to a crisis stabilization unit. That you have to meet criteria to be Baker Acted. In other words, we all have the liberty, right? The civil liberty. It's a part of our Constitution that we are free. And people can't just commit us or put us in a hospital or put us in a jail. There has to be a reason. And so the Baker Act is a really serious thing. I take the Baker Act very seriously. Sometimes I'm asked, because I'm legally allowed to Baker Act somebody based on my license in the state of Florida, if I would consider Baker acting, and I am very slow to Baker Act people, because taking away someone's civil liberty to freedom, I think, has to be a really big deal. In any case, people have to meet the statute, right? It's in statute, it's law. They have to have a threat to harm self or others, or unable to care for oneself. And so it's one of these three, and they have the means to carry it out, which is the reason asking some of the questions like, do you have a plan, is important. And so if we asked somebody if they had a plan and they said yes, and you said, how would you do it? And they said, well, I'd go to the Golden Gate Bridge and jump off, but they live in Pinellas County. They're not going to meet criteria because the Golden Gate Bridge is very far away. Or if they said that they would die by, a gunshot, and they don't have access to a gun, then they might not meet criteria for a Baker Act. The people who can initiate a Baker Act are law enforcement officers, doctors, and social workers. Some of the other licensed professionals, I think, now have the right to Baker Act as well, but it's a very serious thing, and it can't be done just by anybody. If somebody is Baker Acted, the law says that they have up to 3 days to begin to stabilize. And in fact, they have to meet criteria virtually every 24 hours up to that 72 hours. They have to continue to meet criteria. Most people, as you might imagine, after they've been hospitalized against their will, within about 24 hours, if they weren't really serious, they will begin to say to the doctor, I no longer want to die by suicide, because they want to be released. The Marchman Act is very similar, but it is an involuntary procedure for people who are in need of stabilization or treatment due to abusing drugs or alcohol. And this is the criteria here, right? They've lost self-control due to substances, they've inflicted or threatened harm to others or self, and they're in need of substance abuse services. The issue in Pinellas County, of course, is that we do not have a locked Marchman Act facility. So unlike a Baker Act, we have lots of hospitals in Pinellas County, lots and lots and lots. In fact, way too many as far as I'm concerned. But we have lots of hospitals, which means that, you know, for a Baker Act, we always have someplace that we can take people. For a Marchman Act, the hospital isn't really the place to take them, and we don't have a locked Marchman facility. So the place that people usually go due to these issues, unfortunately, is the jail. And so the jail in Pinellas County has become our locked Marchman Act facility. So we are working on this issue, this issue in Pinellas County, but the Marchman Act is hard to use on an involuntary basis. Now, on a voluntary basis, people could show up to a substance abuse treatment facility such as Operation PAR or ACTS, and sometimes they can get a voluntary admission under a Marchman Act without going through the courts. By the way, the involuntary for Marchman and Baker Act is a legal proceeding, and we want it to be a legal proceeding. It should be hard to do this to somebody unless they really, really need it. So what happens to a youth who's Baker acted or Marchman acted? So it depends, but usually a parent or a school, a neighbor will call either the police or they'll call an ambulance, depending on what the circumstances are, right? If somebody's already overdosed and taken a lot of medicine, 911 is going to be called. Someone's going to report that, right? They've taken too much medication, an ambulance is going to show up. Or if somebody is threatening suicide, they have not, they don't have, they haven't taken pills, but they have access to a weapon, 911 is going to be called, and the police are generally going to be sent. So it depends on what the circumstances is. If somebody's taken too many pills, they're generally speaking, they're going to be taken straight to a hospital and then be treated by the hospital. We call that a medical clearance. So they're going to be treated by a physician. And then as soon as they are physically stable, they're going to be committed under an involuntary Baker Act, and they will be transported then to a crisis stabilization unit. Usually, somebody then can be held for up to 3 days. Like I said, that assessment, that evaluation by a physician is going to be done every 24 hours. And then typically by the end of 3 days, people have felt, better. Sometimes they start medication and therapy within that 3 days. They begin to stabilize. They're no longer a threat to themselves or others. And then they're going to be released and connected to treatment with an appointment to see a clinician or to see a psychiatrist after they've been discharged. Any questions here?
No, but thank you for all of this information. It's very informative.
Good.
And there was another one in the chat. Did we get to that one, this second one? It says, if you ever have random depression and don't know why, how do you handle it?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I just to kind of normalize that, I think that the vast majority of us have random depression. Depending on the circumstances that are happening, for example, COVID happens and pretty suddenly I lost my aunt. She died. She was 72 years old, in reasonable health. And she died of COVID very early on. And so having, for me, I had, certainly I felt very sad and weepy, and, just the loss of her was very, very hard. So it depends on what it is maybe that's contributing to the bouts of depression. But first and foremost, I would say that we want to talk about it, right? And maybe not talk about it with everybody, right? But we want to have somebody that we can talk to about those things. When I teach and train on this subject, I often say to people, do you have somebody, if I asked you right this second, I gave you 3 seconds to answer the question, do you have somebody that you could call in the middle of the night who would come to you, who would come and help you. No questions asked, they would come and help you. I think it's important that when we're not feeling sad, depressed, lonely, those kinds of things,
What hole do you guys play after this?
that we have the ability, that we have somebody that we can call, because talking about it can be very helpful. So that's how I would answer that question is, I think it happens to most of us that we have bouts or periods of time when we're not feeling our best or we're feeling depressed. And the best thing to do is to talk about it with someone that you know and trust, in particular, an adult, someone who would know how to help. But sometimes just a good friend is good enough as well, or a teacher, you know, that kind of thing. So are there tools we can use to help someone who may be struggling, and how do we use them? Again, straight talk is probably the best thing that you can do. Professional help is usually needed. Know the signs and symptoms of somebody who is thinking about suicide. One of the signs of symptoms really is that, you know, they're no longer socializing with their friends. They aren't doing the things that they've done. Grades are slipping. They aren't sleeping well. They aren't eating well. Drugs often play a part in suicide, death by suicide. So if somebody, even a teen or an adolescent, starts drinking more, using more drugs, marijuana, you know, synthetics, those kinds of things, all of those things can contribute. Reduce the stigma, right? Through straight talk, that we're talking about it, that we're asking about it, that we are checking in with people even when they aren't in trouble. Never, ever, ever ignore the signs. If you're ever concerned about someone, even if you just have this little tiny nagging concern, that we are elevating that to someone else. Never feel sorry for them or shame them or guilt them, right? Like if you ever did that, I would never sleep again. I would never, you know, I would never have another best friend. I would never get married. I would never, whatever. You know, don't guilt people or shame them. Like I can't believe that you're thinking about that. That would kill your mom. Your mother would never sleep again. Your mother, those kinds of tactics don't seem to be effective. They don't seem to work in terms of preventing a suicide. And then of course, treatment, I always want to go back to, obviously I'm a clinician, so I really firmly believe in treatment. But it doesn't, like I said earlier, it does not have to be in the form of going into a clinic and talking to somebody. It literally can be on the phone with people, and it doesn't even have to be someone they know. It can be the 1-800 text talk lines. So can you Baker Act yourself? How would you do that? You can do a voluntary admission. And the way you would do it is, again, depending on what the circumstances are. If you're at home by yourself, you've taken too much medication, you can call 911 and tell them that, and they'll send either the EMTs or the police to come help you. You can go straight to a hospital. A parent can take you to the hospital and let them know that you have thoughts of dying by suicide. You have a plan, and you absolutely can go in under a voluntary Baker Act. You'll have to answer some questions. Generally, the questions are you thinking about hurting? Are you thinking about dying by suicide? Yes. Do you have a plan? Yes. You know, those kinds of questions is really what would result in a voluntary Baker Act. And how effective are the phones on the bridges at diverting suicide? So there's lots of controversy on this. Some believe that they're very effective. For example, in Pinellas County, after the phones and signs were installed on the Skyway, our suicide rate went down from 8.3% to 6.3%, which was pretty significant. And we all considered that a success. But there are lots of people who think, you know, that signs and phones give people the idea. There's no support, no science to support that. But what I'll say about it is that it's just not enough. Even the reduction to 6.3% is just not enough, right? We still have too many people dying by suicide. In particular, in Pinellas County, it's by the Skyway Bridge. It is the second highest rate of suicide in our country is off the suicide bridge. I mean, off the Skyway Bridge. So, and the first is the Golden Gate Bridge. So it's just simply not enough. So what are the plans there for adding anything to the Skyway Bridge, which of course then is the gold standard, really is a safety net. It makes dying by suicide by jumping off a bridge literally impossible. And so the safety net has been approved. The FDOT, the Florida Department of Transportation, has announced that it will install the safety net on the Skyway Bridge. It's an 8 feet of like metal netting that will be on both sides of the bridge at a cost of about $3 million. This was announced, by the way, in January of this year. And unfortunately, COVID happened in March, and so it's been delayed. I don't know the date at this point for the installation of this safety net, but it really will be a game changer here in Pinellas County. And what are the resources out there to help prevent suicide? Again, we've talked about some of them. The 24-hour, 7 days a week phone number is, critically important, I think. There's quite a few texting apps that can be downloaded. Things like My Friend Asks, My3, Talk Life, the Sandy Hook Promise. You can text the word home to this number. It's free, and a licensed clinician will automatically begin talking to you. There's quite a few of those apps and texting features. And then there is a course called Mental Health First Aid for Youth. I encourage all of you in particular, but many youth, especially the leaders of our high schools and our middle schools, to take the mental health first aid course for youth because it allows you then to recognize signs and symptoms, to kind of be a support group for people that might be at risk of suicide. And that's it. Those were your questions. And look, it's 4 o'clock. We did so good.
That is, we do just have one more question in the chat if you don't
Okay,
mind.
good, yeah.
It's pretty specific, so maybe we might need to follow up on it. Are there any statistics on people who have been treated but are eventually successful? I'm assuming, and you can correct me in the chat if I'm wrong, but probably been treated for, maybe potentially being suicidal, but are eventually successful.
Yeah.
Suicide.
There is quite a bit of, it's hard to get this data, right? It's very hard to get this data because of HIPAA, because of shame, and because of those kinds of things. But I will tell you that of all the people who have attempted to die by suicide by jumping off the Skyway Bridge, who have survived, there was a group about, 8-10 years ago that interviewed many of them. And the number one response from those individuals was, literally the second I jumped, I regretted it. So, I don't know if that answers the question directly. Certainly, we know of a lot of people within my industry who've had multiple attempts and who eventually are successful. I have a sister who lives with depression and anxiety, and she's attempted to die by suicide probably 16 times. And she has said, quit saving me, right? And when she's in her dark place, she'll say, don't save me. And my answer to her is, I will save you every single time. I will do everything I can to save you. So what I will say about her is that for the last 2 years, she's been doing very well. I think she's finally on a treatment regimen, which includes medication, that is doing very, very well for her. So, there are lots of success stories. And then, of course, there are stories where, somebody tries to die, multiple times and eventually they are successful.
Thank you for sharing that, April. That's very relatable for that, clearly.
Yeah.
We do have one more question in the chat. Anybody, because we are short on time, If anybody else has questions, we can definitely email them to you, April, if you might want to provide additional feedback.
Sure.
So the last question in the chat here is, what medicine would you advise for depression? So that's a little bit more vague, but what are your thoughts there?
There are, again, it kind of depends on a variety of things. There are lots of good antidepressant medications. Certainly it depends on how old somebody is, because most of the medications that are available to treat depression are not necessarily designed for children, under the age of like 10, 12. They're more intended for people who have reached kind of a full adult body weight, if you will. And they've been studied on adults, people over the age of 18. There are some, the other thing is are we really talking about depression, or are we talking about anxiety? And so really knowing what kind of the symptoms are would help to identify the medication that would be best. But I would say, Wellbutrin, for example, is a very good antidepressant medication. It's a mild medication with very limited, little side effects. It tends to work very good. Prozac is another one that's pretty good for anxiety over a period of time. The thing to know about medications is that they don't work like a Tylenol. So, when you get a medication for anxiety or depression, they don't begin working immediately. They're often what we call blood level medications, which means that we have to build up a blood level within our blood for them to be effective. And that usually takes about 21 to 28 days. So, it's hard sometimes to make the decision about medication, but if somebody really believes that they could benefit from medication, the sooner they start the medication, probably the better, because it will take, 21 to 28 days for it to reach its full effectiveness. It's not like you can get a prescription from your doctor today and begin feeling better tomorrow, or even later today, right? Because that's how Tylenol or an over-the-counter medication generally works, but it is not how an antidepressant or an anti-anxiety medication works. And there are, of course, I always think that it's important to, when people are feeling depressed and or anxious, that they really look at things like how much sleep they're getting, how much water they're getting to eliminate and or reduce sugar. Doing some of the more natural things can be getting physical exercise, going out for a walk. Those kinds of things can be a very good first start before medication.
Yeah, I wish Commissioner Peters was on here to go over some of her favorite studies about depression and doing exactly what you just said, how that can help, whether it's mild maybe, but that's definitely a helpful start if you're able to do it.
It really is. And another one that sounds kind of hokey is grounding, which is really, kind of bare feet in the grass, just going out and putting your bare feet literally in your yard, and just doing that for 10 minutes a day. It's called grounding, and just the soil, right? Just the natural energy of the soil can be very helpful. So there's quite a few natural things that I think all of us could be practicing and doing, including, anti-bullying type initiatives where we're just nice to each other, and, that we speak to one another, and those kinds of things can actually go a very long way to helping people prevent suicide.
Yeah, for sure. And since we are needing, Maddie, I'll let you wrap it up in a minute here. But if anybody does have any other questions related to anything we've gone over this month for Pinellas County Youth Mental Health Month, then they might not be things that Alyssa and I can directly answer. We're certainly not professionals like April and our other speakers this month. However, we can help facilitate you getting to these speakers to further address any questions you have. So you can message us on Facebook, on our YAC Facebook page, the Pinellas County Youth Advisory Committee, or email YAC, that's YAC, at pinellascounty.org. So yeah, make sure that we don't want to have any questions go unanswered. So Alyssa just put that in the chat as well. Thank you, Alyssa, the email address. And Maddie, I will hand it over to you. April, thank you so much. This has been awesome substance.